The question came during a hospital visit that I thought would be routine, sitting with a friend's father who was dying of cancer. But what Jesus revealed to me about what dying actually feels like will shock your soul, because the experience is nothing like what we've been taught to expect, and everything about how we prepare people for death is wrong. And what makes his answer so shocking is not what happens to your body when you die, but what happens to your soul in those final moments. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this, and if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now, let's get into my story. So, I was sitting in this hospital room in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I had been visiting a church there for a speaking engagement, and my friend Marcus asked if I would come sit with his father, Tom, who was in his final days. Tom had been a believer his whole life, a deacon in his church for 40 years, and he was terrified of dying. I mean, here was this man who had spent decades teaching Sunday school, who could quote scripture about eternal life, who had comforted others facing death, and he was absolutely terrified. His hands were shaking, his breathing was rapid and shallow, and every time he closed his eyes, he would jolt awake with this look of pure panic. "I don't know what it's going to feel like," he whispered to me, gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. "Everyone tells me not to be afraid, that it'll be peaceful, that I'll just slip away. But Jonathan, what if they're wrong? What if it's terrible?" And I sat there, trying to comfort him with all the usual things we tell dying people. You'll be with Jesus. There's no more pain in heaven. It'll be like falling asleep. But even as I said these things, I realized I had no idea if they were true. I had never died. I had never asked Jesus what dying actually feels like. I was just repeating what I had been taught, what the church always says. Tom died 3 hours later, and his final moments they weren't peaceful. He was agitated, frightened, struggling. The hospice nurse said it was normal, that the body fights death even when the mind is ready. But I couldn't shake the image of his terrified face, couldn't stop wondering, what was he experiencing in those final moments? What does dying actually feel like? So that night, back in my hotel room, I found myself on my knees asking a question I had never thought to ask before. Jesus, what does dying actually feel like? What happens to the soul in those final moments? Are we preparing people correctly, or are we giving them false expectations that make it worse? I expected maybe some peace or a comforting scripture to come to mind, or just, some kind of gentle reassurance. But what happened instead was so much more intense than I could have imagined. The hotel room didn't disappear, but suddenly I was experiencing two realities at once. I was still kneeling beside the bed, but I was also in the presence of Jesus, and his expression carried this weight of both compassion and urgency, like he had been waiting for someone to finally ask this question, so he could correct a fundamental misunderstanding. "Jonathan," he said, and his voice had this quality that made my whole body go still. "I'm going to answer your question about what dying feels like. But my answer is going to shock you, because what actually happens in those final moments is nothing like what the church has been teaching people to expect." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean?" "The church has created a comfortable narrative about death," he explained, telling people it will be peaceful, gentle, like falling asleep. But for many believers, dying is not peaceful at all, and the reason has nothing to do with their salvation, and everything to do with what's actually happening to their soul in those final moments. So I'm kneeling there, and this vision starts to unfold. I could see. It was like I could witness the moment of death from the perspective of the dying person's soul, and what I saw was nothing like what I had been taught to expect. "Look at this believer," Jesus said, showing me someone I'll call Sarah. She was a faithful Christian, genuinely saved, lying in a hospital bed in her final moments. And based on everything the church teaches, her death should have been peaceful. She should have just slipped away gently into Jesus' arms. But that's not what I saw happening at all. As Sarah's body began to shut down, I could see her soul becoming aware of something that her physical senses had been blocking her entire life. It was like, imagine you've been in a soundproof room your whole life, and suddenly the walls start to become transparent. You're becoming aware of realities that were always there, but that your physical body had been shielding you from. And Sarah was terrified. Not because she was going to hell, she wasn't. Not because she doubted her salvation, she didn't. She was terrified because dying was forcing her soul to transition from the physical realm to the spiritual realm, and that transition was nothing like falling asleep. "This is what dying actually feels like," Jesus explained, and his voice carried this profound sadness. "It's not peaceful for most people because they're experiencing something their soul has never experienced before, the separation from the physical body and the sudden awareness of spiritual realities that the body had been filtering out." I watched as Sarah's soul began to separate from her body, and the experience was, I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was intensely disorienting, overwhelming, like every sense you've ever had is being recalibrated all at once. She could suddenly perceive spiritual realities, angels, demons, the spiritual atmosphere of the room, and her soul was not prepared for this sudden awareness. "But she's saved," I said, confused and honestly a bit horrified. "Why is she so afraid if she's going to be with you?" "Because," Jesus replied, "the church has taught people that dying will be peaceful, but they haven't taught them what dying actually involves. They've told people that death is like falling asleep, but death is actually the soul's transition from one realm of reality to another, and that transition is profound, overwhelming, and often frightening, not because of where they're going, but because of what they're experiencing in the transition." The vision expanded, and I began to see other believers in their final moments. Some were peaceful, yes, but many were not. Many were experiencing what Sarah was experiencing, a sudden, overwhelming awareness of spiritual realities that their physical bodies had been shielding them from their entire lives. "Look at this man," Jesus said, showing me a pastor who had spent 40 years teaching about heaven. He was dying, and he was genuinely saved, but his final moments were filled with confusion and fear because what he was experiencing didn't match what he had been taught to expect. He had expected to just close his eyes and wake up in heaven. Instead, he was experiencing his soul separating from his body, becoming aware of spiritual realities he had only known intellectually, feeling the weight of eternity in a way that was completely overwhelming. "This pastor is going to heaven," Jesus explained. "His salvation is secure. But his death is not peaceful because he was not prepared for what dying actually involves. He was taught that it would be gentle, easy, like falling asleep. But dying is the soul's birth into eternity, and birth is not gentle or easy. And that comparison it hit me like a physical blow. Birth. Jesus was comparing dying to birth, and suddenly I understood why so many believers die in fear and confusion despite being saved. They're experiencing something as profound and overwhelming as being born, but they've been told it will be like falling asleep. "The church has failed, my people," Jesus said, and I could hear the grief in his voice, "by giving them false expectations about death. They've made death sound peaceful and gentle because they want to comfort people. But in doing so, they've left people completely unprepared for what actually happens when the soul transitions from the physical realm to the spiritual realm." I watched as believer after believer experienced this same pattern. Genuine Christians, truly saved, but dying in fear and confusion because what they were experiencing didn't match what they had been taught to expect. Their souls were separating from their bodies, becoming aware of spiritual realities, transitioning from one realm to another, and the experience was overwhelming, disorienting, and often terrifying. "But what about the people who do die peacefully?" I asked, thinking of the stories I had heard about believers who just smiled and slipped away. "Some do," Jesus acknowledged. "Some souls are more prepared for the transition. Some have spent their lives becoming aware of spiritual realities, so the sudden full awareness at death is not as shocking. Some have cultivated such intimacy with me that my presence overwhelms any fear. But Jonathan, these are the exception, not the rule. Most believers die in fear because they were not prepared for what dying actually involves." The vision shifted, and Jesus showed me something that made my blood run cold. He showed me how the church's comfortable narrative about death was actually making things worse for dying believers. Because when people expected death to be peaceful and gentle, and then experienced the overwhelming reality of their soul transitioning to the spiritual realm, they panicked. They thought something was wrong. They thought maybe they weren't saved after all. They thought they were experiencing judgment rather than transition. "Look at this woman," Jesus said, showing me someone dying in a hospice. She was a believer, genuinely saved, but as her soul began to separate from her body and she became aware of spiritual realities, she panicked because it wasn't peaceful like she had been told it would be. and in her panic she began to doubt her salvation, began to think that the fear she was experiencing meant she was going to hell. "This woman is going to heaven," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow. But her final moments are filled with unnecessary terror because she was given false expectations about what dying would feel like. She thinks her fear means she's not saved, when actually her fear is just the natural response to the soul's transition from one realm to another. As the vision continued, I began to understand that Jesus was revealing something the church desperately needed to hear but had been avoiding because it was uncomfortable. Dying is not peaceful for most people. It's not gentle. It's not like falling asleep. It's the soul's birth into eternity, and like physical birth, it's intense, overwhelming, and often frightening. "Tomorrow night," Jesus said, "I'm going to show you why dying feels this way, what's actually happening to the soul in those final moments, and why the transition from physical to spiritual reality is so overwhelming. I'm going to reveal what the church should be teaching people about death instead of the comfortable lies they've been telling." But before the vision faded, he said something that would haunt me until our next encounter. The church thinks they're being kind by telling people that death will be peaceful, but they're actually being cruel, because they're leaving people completely unprepared for the most profound transition their soul will ever experience, and that lack of preparation is causing unnecessary fear, confusion, and doubt in the final moments of countless believers' lives. As I found myself back in my hotel room, still kneeling beside the bed, tears streaming down my face, my whole body shaking, I realized that Jesus had just exposed one of the church's most well-intentioned but devastating lies. We tell people that dying will be peaceful because we want to comfort them, but in doing so, we leave them completely unprepared for what actually happens when the soul transitions from the physical realm to the spiritual realm. And I thought about Tom, my friend's father, dying in fear just hours earlier. Had his terror been made worse by false expectations? Had he thought something was wrong because his death wasn't peaceful like everyone had told him it would be? Had he doubted his salvation in those final moments because what he was experiencing didn't match what he had been taught to expect? The question that kept me awake the rest of that night was both personal and urgent. If dying is not peaceful for most believers, if it's actually the soul's overwhelming transition from one realm of reality to another, then what should we be telling people? How should we be preparing them? And what's actually happening to the soul in those final moments that makes the experience so intense? I knew that tomorrow night's vision was going to challenge everything the church teaches about death. And honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. Because if Jesus was right, and of course he was right, then we had been comforting dying people with lies, and those lies were making their final moments more terrifying than they needed to be. The second night brought revelations that exposed what's actually happening to the soul during those final moments of life. After Jesus showed me that dying is not peaceful for most believers, I spent the entire day unable to stop thinking about Tom's terrified face, about all the dying people I had tried to comfort with lies about peaceful transitions, about how unprepared the church has left people for the most profound experience of their lives. What Jesus would show me about the soul's transition from physical to spiritual reality would prove that everything we think we know about dying is wrong. So, I couldn't function that whole day. I mean, I was supposed to fly back to LA, but I couldn't get on the plane. I kept thinking about what Jesus had shown me, that dying isn't peaceful for most people, that it's this overwhelming transition that the church has completely failed to prepare people for. And I kept wondering, what's actually happening? Why is it so intense? I ended up staying another night in Cedar Rapids, and at exactly 11:47 p.m., I remember the time because it felt significant, like I was approaching midnight, approaching some kind of threshold, my hotel room filled with that overwhelming presence again. Jesus was there, and his expression carried this mixture of compassion and determination, like a doctor who was about to explain a difficult diagnosis, but who also had the treatment plan ready. "Tonight," he said, and his voice had this quality of both gentleness and urgency, "I'm going to show you what's actually happening to the soul in those final moments of life. I'm going to reveal why the transition from physical to spiritual reality is so overwhelming, and why the church's comfortable narrative about peaceful death has left people completely unprepared." The room dissolved, and I found myself in this place where I could see. It was like I could perceive both the physical and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. And Jesus was about to show me what dying people experience as their souls transition between these realities. The first thing you need to understand, Jesus explained, is that your physical body has been functioning as a filter your entire life. It filters out spiritual realities, limiting your soul's awareness to the physical realm. This filtering is necessary for life on earth. If humans were fully aware of spiritual realities all the time, they couldn't function in the physical world. So he showed me what this looks like. I could see a living person, let me call her Jennifer, and I could see how her physical body was acting like a lens that focused her soul's awareness on physical reality, while filtering out spiritual reality. She could see physical objects, hear physical sounds, feel physical sensations, but the spiritual realm, the angels around her, the spiritual atmosphere, the reality of eternity, all of that was being filtered out by her body. This is normal, Jesus said. This is how I designed physical life to work. The body focuses the soul's awareness on the physical realm, but when the body begins to die, this filtering system starts to break down. And as it breaks down, the soul begins to become aware of spiritual realities that have been there all along, but that the body has been blocking. And suddenly I understood why dying is so overwhelming. It's not that something new is happening, it's that the soul is suddenly becoming aware of realities that have always been there, but that the physical body has been shielding it from. Watch what happens as Jennifer's body begins to shut down, Jesus said, and I observed as her physical systems started to fail. And as they failed, I could see her soul's awareness beginning to expand beyond the physical realm. At first it was subtle. She started to sense presences in the room that her physical eyes couldn't see. She became aware of a spiritual atmosphere that her physical senses had been filtering out. It was like, imagine you've been wearing noise-canceling headphones your whole life, and they're slowly being removed. You're starting to hear sounds that were always there but that you've never been aware of before. And Jennifer was confused. She kept looking around the room, sensing things she couldn't explain, feeling presences she couldn't identify. Her family thought she was hallucinating, that the dying process was causing her to see things that weren't there. But Jesus showed me that she wasn't hallucinating, she was becoming aware of spiritual realities that her body had been filtering out her entire life. This is the first stage of dying, Jesus explained. The filter begins to break down, and the soul starts to perceive spiritual realities. For most people, this is deeply disorienting because they've never experienced it before. They don't understand what's happening to them. The second thing Jesus showed me was even more intense. The second thing that happens, he continued, is that as the body continues to shut down, the soul begins to separate from the physical body. And this separation is not gentle or peaceful, it's profound and overwhelming because the soul has been integrated with the body for an entire lifetime. So I watched as Jennifer's soul began to separate from her body, and the experience was, I don't even have words for it. It wasn't painful in a physical sense, but it was intensely disorienting. Her soul had been connected to her body for 73 years. Every sensation, every experience, every moment of awareness had been filtered through that body. And now that connection was being severed. Imagine, Jesus said, that you've been wearing a suit of armor your entire life so long that you've forgotten you're wearing it, so long that you think the armor is part of you. And now that armor is being removed, piece by piece. You're becoming aware of yourself as separate from the armor, but the process of separation is disorienting because you've never experienced yourself without it. And I watched as Jennifer's soul struggled with this separation. She was still aware of her body, she could see it lying on the bed, but she was also becoming aware of herself as distinct from her body, and this dual awareness was overwhelming, confusing, frightening. This is why dying people often seem agitated or restless. Jesus explained. They're experiencing their soul separating from their body, and it's not a peaceful process. It's profound, overwhelming, and often frightening, not because they're going to hell, but because they're experiencing something their soul has never experienced before. The third thing Jesus showed me was the most shocking of all. The third thing that happens, he said, his voice taking on particular intensity, is that as the soul separates from the body, it becomes fully aware of spiritual realities without any physical filtering. And for most people, this sudden, complete awareness is absolutely overwhelming. I watched as Jennifer's soul fully separated from her body, and in that moment, She became aware of spiritual realities with a clarity and intensity she had never experienced. She could see angels. She could perceive the spiritual atmosphere of the room. She could sense the presence of spiritual beings, both holy and unholy. She could feel the weight of eternity in a way that was completely overwhelming, and she was terrified. Not because she was going to hell, she was a genuine believer, and I could see that her destination was secure. She was terrified because the sudden, complete awareness of spiritual reality was so intense, so overwhelming, so different from anything she had ever experienced that her soul didn't know how to process it. "Look at what she's experiencing," Jesus said, and I could see into Jennifer's awareness. She was perceiving dimensions of reality that she had only known intellectually. She was seeing angels that she had believed in but never seen. She was feeling the presence of God in a way that was so intense it was almost unbearable. She was becoming aware of the spiritual battle that had been raging around her entire life, but that her physical body had been shielding her from. "This is what dying actually feels like," Jesus explained. "It's not peaceful. It's not gentle. It's the soul's sudden, complete awareness of spiritual realities that the body has been filtering out for an entire lifetime. And for most people, this sudden awareness is overwhelming, disorienting, and frightening. But then Jesus showed me something that gave me hope in the midst of all this intensity. However, he said, "Watch what happens next." And I saw Jennifer's soul, after those initial moments of overwhelming awareness and fear, beginning to orient itself. She started to recognize the presence of God that she had been sensing. She began to understand that the angels she was seeing were there to help her, not harm her. She started to realize that the intensity she was experiencing was not judgment but transition, and as she oriented herself to these spiritual realities, I watched as Jesus himself came to her. Not in a vision, not in a dream, but actually present in the spiritual realm that she could now fully perceive. And his presence began to calm her fear, to orient her awareness, to help her soul adjust to the overwhelming realities it was now experiencing. "This is what I do for every believer who dies," Jesus explained, and his voice was filled with such tenderness. "I come to them in those final moments. I help them orient themselves to spiritual reality. I calm their fear. I guide them through the transition. But Jonathan, the transition is still overwhelming, still intense, still frightening because it's the soul's birth into eternity." The fourth thing Jesus showed me explained why some people die peacefully while others don't. "Some souls," he said, "are more prepared for this transition than others. Some people have spent their lives becoming aware of spiritual realities, cultivating sensitivity to my presence, learning to perceive beyond the physical. For these people, the sudden full awareness at death is not as shocking because they've been developing that awareness throughout their lives." So he showed me a believer, I'll call him David, who had spent his life in contemplative prayer, in worship, in cultivating awareness of God's presence. He had learned to perceive spiritual realities even while his body was still filtering them. He had developed what some call spiritual senses, the ability to perceive God's presence, to sense spiritual atmospheres, to be aware of realities beyond the physical. And when David died, the transition was still intense, still profound, but it wasn't as terrifying because his soul was already somewhat familiar with spiritual awareness. It was like he had been practicing for this moment his entire life without even realizing it. "This is why I call my people to cultivate spiritual awareness during their lives," Jesus explained. "Not just to have better spiritual experiences on earth, but to prepare their souls for the transition they will experience at death. Those who have learned to perceive my presence, to be aware of spiritual realities, to live with one foot in the physical realm and one foot in the spiritual realm, these people die more peacefully because their souls are prepared for the transition." The fifth thing Jesus showed me was the most important of all. "The fifth thing you need to understand," he said, "is that the intensity of dying has nothing to do with someone's salvation or their destination. A believer who dies in fear and confusion is still going to heaven. The fear is not a sign of judgment, it's a sign of transition. It's the soul's natural response to the overwhelming experience of moving from one realm of reality to another." And he showed me believers who had died in terror, whose final moments had been filled with fear and confusion. And I watched as they arrived in heaven, their salvation secure, their destination never in doubt. The fear they had experienced was not about where they were going, it was about what they were experiencing in the transition. This is what the church needs to understand. Jesus said, his voice carrying both urgency and compassion. When dying, people are afraid, when they're agitated, when they seem to be struggling, it doesn't mean they're not saved. It doesn't mean they're going to hell. It means they're experiencing the overwhelming transition from physical to spiritual reality, and they need help understanding what's happening to them. As Jesus revealed these 5 aspects of what actually happens to the soul during dying, the breakdown of physical filtering, the separation from the body, the sudden, complete awareness of spiritual reality, the varying levels of preparation, and the distinction between transition and destination, I began to understand why the Church's comfortable narrative about peaceful death was so damaging. We tell people that dying will be peaceful because we want to comfort them, but in doing so, we leave them completely unprepared for what actually happens. And when they experience the overwhelming intensity of their soul transitioning from physical to spiritual reality, they think something is wrong. They think they're not saved. They think they're experiencing judgment when they're actually just experiencing transition. Tomorrow night, Jesus said as the vision began to fade, I'm going to show you what the Church should be teaching people about death. I'm going to reveal how to prepare people for the transition their souls will experience, and how to help dying people understand what's happening to them so they don't mistake transition for judgment. As I found myself back in my hotel room, the weight of what Jesus had revealed pressed down on me. Dying is not peaceful for most people because it's the soul's overwhelming transition from one realm of reality to another. The physical body that has been filtering spiritual realities for an entire lifetime breaks down, the soul separates from the body, and suddenly the person becomes fully aware of spiritual dimensions they've never perceived before. And we've been telling people it will be like falling asleep. We've been giving them false expectations that make the experience more terrifying, because when it's not peaceful, they think something is wrong. I thought about Tom again, dying in fear just 2 days earlier. Had he been experiencing what Jesus had shown me? Had his soul been separating from his body, becoming aware of spiritual realities, transitioning from one realm to another? Had his fear been the natural response to this overwhelming transition, or had it been made worse by false expectations that his death should be peaceful? The question that consumed me was both urgent and practical. If this is what dying actually feels like, then what should we be telling people? How should we be preparing them? And how can we help dying people understand that the intensity they're experiencing is transition, not judgment? The third night brought the revelation that could transform how we prepare people for death and how we comfort those who are dying. After Jesus showed me what actually happens to the soul during those final moments, I spent the entire day wrestling with a new question. If dying is this overwhelming transition that most people aren't prepared for, then how should we be preparing them? What Jesus would show me about preparing for death would prove both more challenging and more practical than anything the Church currently teaches. So, that whole day I was a mess, honestly. I kept thinking about all the dying people I had tried to comfort over the years, all the times I had told them it would be peaceful, that they would just slip away gently. And now I knew I had been giving them false expectations that probably made their deaths more terrifying. I called Marcus, my friend whose father had died, and I tried to explain what Jesus had shown me. I think your dad's fear wasn't because he wasn't saved, I told to him. I think it was because he was experiencing something overwhelming that no one had prepared him for. Marcus was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I wish someone had told us that. We kept trying to calm him down, kept telling him it should be peaceful, and I think that made him more afraid because what he was experiencing wasn't peaceful at all. At exactly 11:47 p.m., same time as the night before, my hotel room filled with that presence again. Jesus was there, and his expression carried this sense of eager anticipation, like he was finally going to reveal the solution to a problem that had been causing unnecessary suffering for too long. Tonight, he said, and his voice carried both authority and hope, I'm going to show you how to prepare people for the transition their souls will experience at death. I'm going to reveal what the Church should be teaching instead of comfortable lies about peaceful death. And I'm going to give you practical ways to help dying people understand what's happening to them. The room dissolved, and I found myself in this place where I could see believers across time, some preparing for death, some in the process of dying, some helping others die. And Jesus was about to show me what true preparation for death actually looks like. The first thing people need to understand, Jesus explained, is the truth about what dying involves. Not comfortable lies, but honest truth that prepares them for the intensity of the transition. So he showed me a pastor, I'll call him Robert, who had decided to start teaching his congregation the truth about dying. Instead of telling them it would be peaceful and gentle, he told them what Jesus had shown me, that dying is the soul's transition from physical to spiritual reality, that it's often overwhelming and intense, that it's like being born into eternity. At first, people were upset. "Why are you scaring us?" they asked. "Why can't you just comfort us like other pastors do?" But Robert persisted. "I'm not trying to scare you," he explained. "I'm trying to prepare you. If you expect death to be peaceful and it's not, you'll think something is wrong. But if you understand that dying is an intense transition, then when you experience that intensity, you'll know it's normal. You'll know you're not being judged, you're just transitioning." And I watched as this honest teaching transformed how his congregation approached death. When members of his church began to die, they were still afraid, the transition was still overwhelming, but they weren't panicked because they understood what was happening to them. They knew the intensity was normal. They knew it didn't mean they weren't saved. "This is the first step to preparing people for death," Jesus said. "Tell them the truth. Stop giving them false expectations that will make the experience more terrifying when it doesn't match what they've been told to expect." The second thing Jesus showed me was even more practical. "The second thing people need," he continued, "is to develop spiritual awareness during their lives so their souls are prepared for the sudden full awareness they'll experience at death." So he showed me believers who were intentionally cultivating what he called spiritual senses, learning to perceive his presence, to be aware of spiritual realities, to live with awareness of both physical and spiritual dimensions. "Look at this woman," Jesus said, showing me someone named Maria, who spent time each day in contemplative prayer. She wasn't just talking to God, she was learning to sense his presence, to perceive his nearness, to be aware of spiritual realities beyond the physical. Maria is preparing for death without even realizing it. Jesus explained, by cultivating spiritual awareness during her life, she's preparing her soul for the transition it will experience at death. When her body's filtering system breaks down and she becomes fully aware of spiritual realities, it won't be as shocking because she's been developing that awareness all along. And I watched as Maria died years later, and while the transition was still intense, still profound, it wasn't as terrifying as it was for others because her soul was already somewhat familiar with spiritual awareness. She had been practicing for this moment her entire life. "This is why I call my people to cultivate spiritual awareness," Jesus said, "not just for better spiritual experiences on earth, but to prepare their souls for the transition they will experience at death." Prayer, worship, meditation on my word, practicing my presence, all of these develop spiritual awareness that prepares the soul for dying. The third thing Jesus showed me addressed how to help people who are actually in the process of dying. "The third thing people need," he said, "is for those around them to understand what's happening and to help them interpret their experience correctly." So he showed me a hospice chaplain, I'll call her Susan, who had learned to recognize the signs that someone's soul was beginning to transition. When dying people became agitated or fearful, when they seemed to be seeing things others couldn't see, when they appeared confused or disoriented, Susan understood what was happening. "Your body's filtering system is breaking down," she would tell them gently. "You're starting to become aware of spiritual realities that have been there all along. What you're experiencing is normal. It's not judgment, it's transition. Jesus is here with you, helping you through this." And I watched as this understanding transformed dying people's experiences. They were still afraid, the transition was still overwhelming, but they weren't panicked because someone was helping them understand what was happening. They weren't alone in their confusion. "Look at this man," Jesus said, showing me someone dying with Susan's help. He was experiencing the overwhelming awareness of spiritual realities, and he was frightened. But Susan was there, speaking calmly. "I know it's intense. I know it's overwhelming, but you're not being judged. You're transitioning. Your soul is separating from your body and becoming aware of spiritual realities. Jesus is here. Can you sense his presence?" And I watched as the man's fear began to calm, not because the intensity decreased, but because he understood what was happening. He stopped fighting the transition and started surrendering to it. "This is what dying people need," Jesus explained. They need someone who understands what's happening to help them interpret their experience. They need someone to tell them, this is normal, this is transition, you're not being judged. Jesus is here. The fourth thing Jesus showed me was about the actual moment of death. The fourth thing people need to know, he said, is that I am present with every believer who dies. I come to them in those final moments. I help them through the transition. They are never alone. So he showed me what actually happens in those final moments for believers. As the soul completes its separation from the body and becomes fully aware of spiritual reality, Jesus himself is there. Not in a vision, not symbolically, but actually present in the spiritual realm that the dying person can now fully perceive. Watch this woman, Jesus said, showing me someone in her final moments. Her soul had separated from her body. She was overwhelmed by spiritual awareness. She was frightened by the intensity of what she was experiencing. But then she became aware of Jesus' presence, actually saw him, actually felt him, actually heard him speaking to her. I'm here, Jesus was saying to her. You're safe. You're transitioning. I'm going to help you. And his presence began to calm her fear, to orient her awareness, to help her soul adjust to the overwhelming realities it was now experiencing. I do this for every believer, Jesus explained to me, and his voice was filled with such tenderness. I am present with them in those final moments. I help them through the transition. But Jonathan, it helps if they've been taught to expect my presence, if they've learned to recognize my voice, if they've cultivated awareness of me during their lives. The fifth thing Jesus showed me was the most important of all. The fifth thing people need, he said, is to understand that the intensity of dying has nothing to do with their salvation. Fear during death does not mean they're going to hell. Struggle during death does not mean they're being judged. The intensity is just the soul's natural response to the overwhelming transition from one realm of reality to another. And he showed me dying believers who needed to hear this message desperately. They were experiencing overwhelming intensity, and they were interpreting it as judgment. They thought their fear meant they weren't saved. They thought the struggle meant they were going to hell. You need to tell them, Jesus said, showing me how to minister to dying people, that what they're experiencing is transition, not judgment. That fear is normal. That intensity is expected. That their salvation is secure, even though the transition is overwhelming. I watched as this truth transformed dying people's final moments. When they understood that the intensity didn't mean they were being judged, when they realized that fear was a normal response to transition, when they knew their salvation was secure despite the overwhelming experience, they could surrender to the process instead of fighting it. As Jesus revealed these 5 aspects of preparing for death, teaching the truth about dying, cultivating spiritual awareness during life, helping dying people interpret their experience, recognizing Jesus' presence in final moments, and understanding that intensity doesn't equal judgment, I began to see how radically different this was from what the church currently teaches. So, I said, trying to make sure I understood, we should stop telling people that dying will be peaceful. You should stop lying to them. Jesus replied, and his voice was firm but loving. Tell them the truth. Dying is often intense and overwhelming because it's the soul's transition from one realm of reality to another. But also tell them that the intensity is normal, that I will be with them, that their salvation is secure, and that they can prepare for the transition by cultivating spiritual awareness during their lives. As the vision began to fade, Jesus spoke one final time, and his words would change how I approach death and dying forever. Tell my people that death is not the enemy they think it is. Yes, it's intense. Yes, it's overwhelming. Yes, it's often frightening, but it's also the doorway to everything they've been longing for their entire lives. It's birth into eternity. It's the completion of their journey. It's coming home. And tell them, he continued, that they can prepare for this transition, not by denying its intensity, not by pretending it will be peaceful, but by cultivating spiritual awareness during their lives, by learning to recognize my presence, by developing their spiritual senses so their souls are ready for the sudden full awareness they'll experience at death. As his presence faded, I was left with a truth that was both challenging and hopeful. Dying is not peaceful for most people, but it doesn't have to be terrifying either. If we prepare people correctly, if we tell them the truth about what dying involves, if we help them understand that intensity is transition rather than judgment, then they can face death with honest awareness rather than false expectations. The comfortable lie that dying is peaceful has been causing unnecessary terror in the final moments of countless believers' lives. When people expect peace and experience intensity, they panic. They think something is wrong. They doubt their salvation. But if we tell them the truth that dying is the soul's overwhelming transition from one realm to another, that intensity is normal, that Jesus is present to help them through it, then they can surrender to the process instead of fighting it. So here's the shocking truth about what dying actually feels like. For most believers, it's not peaceful. It's intense, overwhelming, and often frightening, not because they're going to hell, but because their soul is experiencing something it's never experienced before. The physical body that has been filtering spiritual realities for an entire lifetime breaks down. The soul separates from the body. Spiritual realities that have always been there, but that the body has been blocking, suddenly become fully apparent. But this intensity is not judgment, it's transition. It's the soul's birth into eternity. And just like physical birth is intense and overwhelming, spiritual birth into eternity is intense and overwhelming. The fear is normal, the struggle is expected, and Jesus is present in those final moments, helping every believer through the transition. We can prepare for this transition by cultivating spiritual awareness during our lives, learning to sense God's presence, developing our spiritual senses, becoming familiar with spiritual realities so the sudden full awareness at death is not as shocking. We can help dying people by telling them the truth about what's happening, by helping them interpret their experience correctly, by assuring them that intensity doesn't mean judgment. And we can stop lying to people about death being peaceful. We can start telling them the truth. Dying is often intense and overwhelming, but that intensity is just transition, not judgment. Your salvation is secure even if your death is not peaceful. Jesus is present even if you're afraid. And the overwhelming experience you're having is not a sign that something is wrong, it's a sign that your soul is being born into eternity.